Hey there YouTube, Craig here. I thought I would show you my recent project. As you see here, the rear axle is gone off the Buick. I removed it last weekend. There was nothing wrong with the car. I just stopped the problem dead in its tracks. And I'll show you it. Here's the rear axle that I took out of it, the old one. Here's what a normal spring perch looks like, even though it's all rotted to crap. And here is what the faulty one looks like. See, what happens is underneath these rubber insulators, salt and water gets underneath there and rots out the metal. And the only thing that was holding the spring in was this insulator. The center cone was still there. It was just seized right on the insulator like that. And I didn't want to risk popping a spring, so I decided to tackle the project when the weather was good. So yeah. And I got a replacement rear axle about 3 weeks ago from the junkyard. It costed me $123. That's the part, the tax, environmental fees, and the core charge. Because I got to return the old one when I put the new one in. And I'm replacing the shocks. They're pretty terrible. They're the original ones. No resistance whatsoever. And that one, I think, was leaking because it's a little wet. And I'll show you the new rear axle. Hold on. This is the replacement junkyard rear axle, which I got about 3 weeks ago. This axle isn't exactly perfect, so think before you start criticizing in this video. This is the best I could find out here in the Rust Belt. It was very frustrating trying to find a decent axle for my car. A lot of them had that same rust problem. As soon as you would beat on the bottom of the perches, it never doubts, holes will start to emerge on the top of the perch, or on the perch. What attracted me to this axle is that it had decent trailing arm bushings. These are a little cracked, but they're not bad. It had decent brake hoses. It had decent centering cones for the springs. A lot of the cones I found on these axles were cracked up and broken off. This axle came from a 96 vehicle. The only difference is the 96 vehicle used anti-lock brakes. The spindles are exactly the same as mine, but these spindles on the anti-lock brake versions have an electrical connector on the back. Otherwise, it's the same spindle. It uses the same brakes as mine. It uses the same wheel cylinders as mine. And I managed to get the track bar loose. I broke the body of the car in the junkyard to get the track bar off. I didn't want to saw the track bar. I wanted to reuse the track bar. Usually what happens is the bolts, the through bolts, they seize on these metal sleeves right here, and it's a pain to get those bolts out. So I took a couple cold chisels and I ruined the body on the car, or the mount, to get the track bar off. This axle came with good brake drums too. Even though I'm not going to use these, I'll hold on to them. And here's for the bad part. When I got the axle home that night from the junkyard, I started pounding on the track bar bolt to get it off, and the blows from the hammer knocked some rust loose in this perch, which I was not too happy about. What I did was I took a piece of metal, I fabricated a piece of metal, and I covered up the damaged portion. After I cut the damaged portion out, I covered it up with a piece of metal and I welded around it. And I also built up the top up with weld to cover up the damaged area too. And there was a small pinhole rust hole I covered up with weld on the bottom, and there was another hole that I punched through with a screwdriver. That hole I covered up with an electrical box knockout, and I welded around it. And I built up the welds on those too, and I ground everything down, and I put a reinforcement plate which I made out of a piece of metal over the top of the perch. And I welded around it along with the cone too. Yeah, this perch, even though the metal was, it had some damage, it was fixable. There's some thin parts in the metal, otherwise the metal is pretty solid. And I put that reinforcement plate in here. And when I got done, I sprayed everything down with some, what's that, rubberized undercoating. This insulator does not fit exactly flat, but once the spring gets tension and seats on the insulator, it'll push the insulator flat. Because it can't fit all the way flat with all these welds on there. Like I said, this axle isn't exactly perfect, but it's the best I could find out here in the Rust Belt. It was very frustrating trying to find a decent axle. I wish I had access to southern parts, but I don't. I live up here in Wisconsin. That's down south and out west. Well, everyone, the transplant is now complete. It took me several hours. There was a few struggles, but that's a part of doing something for the first time that you're not familiar with, or attempting a project that you're not familiar with for the first time. And now what needs to be done now is the brake work, and I'll do that time by time throughout the week because it's supposed to rain the next few days or couple days. I'm not going to work in the rain. I got my new Gabriel shocks installed, $26 a pair on eBay with free shipping. You couldn't beat that price. And I think with the new shocks, the rear end of the car is going to sit much higher now instead of sitting kind of low. It was sitting okay, but I think it was sitting just a tad bit low, and I think the shocks were the problem. I originally thought of replacing the springs, but after looking at the springs, they looked okay. I think it was just the shocks that were the problem, which caused the rear end to sit so low. And I gotta get a nut for that track bar bolt. I had the nut in my hand and it slipped out of my hand and it fell somewhere. I was frustrated as hell. On the bolt, I put some anti-seize compound on the bolt, so that way if the assembly has to come apart again, the bolt will pound out just fine instead of seizing on that sleeve in there. And I replaced all the trailing arm bolts on each side. There's new bolts on. I got them at Menards. They're hardened body bolts. They're about that long. They were $2 for a pack of 2. And they're hardened body bolts. They're black bolts and they got a point at the end, just like the old ones. And I put anti-seize compound on the bolts, on the body bolts too, so that way if anything has to come apart again, all the parts will come out just fine instead of seizing on the mounts or whatever they're on. And this is the perch that I redneck repaired. It looks fine. I knew it was gonna work out. Everything's seating okay. Like I said, this is not the best axle, but this is the best I could find out here in the Rust Belt. So now I'm going to go in the house and take a shower and grab a drink because I'm tired. And that concludes this video. Bye.